Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Victoria Wells. I'm a Professor of Sustainable Management at the University of York School for Business and Society, and I'm here to welcome you to this event at the York Festival of Ideas today. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Adrian Tierney-Jones. Adrian is an award-winning journalist and writer on beer, travel and pubs, and as I've just found out, used to be a musician as well, and was Beer Writer of the Year in 2017. He loves nothing better than to wander cities, towns and the countryside and to visit pubs and bars, and I know he's already popped into a pub in York today. I'm sure there may be some more. He's contributed to many, only one so far. He has contributed to many magazines and newspapers, and his books include The 7 Moods of Craft Beer and The United Kingdom of Beer. Today, he's going to talk to us about his search for the best pub in the UK, and we'll be having some time for question and answers at the end as well. And with that, I will hand you over to our speaker, Adrian.
Thank you. As Victoria said, I'm a journalist, writer. The unenviable task of touring the country and Europe, seeking out pubs, beer, and travel. My book, A Pub for All Seasons, I think is either my 17th or 18th book, but it was a bit of a departure for me in that it's a narrative non-fiction book. I've done a lot of list books, as Victoria said, The 7 Moods of Craft Beer, United Kingdom of Beer. I edited 3 editions of 1,001 Beers You Must Try Before You Die. I didn't try them all. I had writers across the world, giving me feedback on them. But I did manage, last time I looked, I had tried about 600 of them in my travels. And so, it's a blend of, the way I pitched it to the publishers, I'd written a feature, 2017, about how pubs have unconsciously, organically, their moods change throughout the season. The seasons. For instance, I'm not talking about Wetherspoons, as I mentioned in my book, and I don't have a problem with Wetherspoons, obviously the owner, but that's my thing. But I think they provide a function for people, especially people on their own and everything. But if the good pubs that change throughout the seasons, you think about a pub, for instance, that you go into in the autumn. People are starting to move indoors again. The mood is different. People are sitting closer together, so they're not. When they're in the beer garden, there's a lot of people shouting to mates and everything like that, friends and all that. Well, once you're in the autumn, the fire is lit. There's a more melancholy aspect to the pub, in my view. So, and then the winter comes along. Of course, we've got Christmas, and then we have obviously dry January. And my book is divided into 4 chapters. Obviously, the 4 seasons, and all of them have about 5 sub-chapters, and they're all titled like Melancholia, Celebration, etc. While in February, in winter, I did have one sub-chapter called, I don't remember what it's called. It's during the January thing. Abstinence, that's it, it's called Abstinence. That's the shortest chapter in the book, it's 70 words. Because I don't really do abstinence, and besides my mother died during that month, so I didn't really feel like doing it. And my whole point of the book was it's a mixture of travel, pubs, beer, there's a bit of beer in it as well, and people, because I started off writing pub reviews for the Daily Telegraph in 2008, and at the time I realised you just don't want to write a pub review where you say, well, this pub sells this beer, oh, look at the nice surroundings. I wanted to engage with the people who went to the pub. So it's a story about people in the pub as well. And I sit there sometimes with my notebook, and sometimes people say, what the bloody hell are you doing? As that happened to me in the grill in Aberdeen. And I listen to people's conversations. And as one review in a newspaper, I think it was the Mail on Sunday, said I brought to life some pub bores, but somehow gave them a bit of sparkle by replicating their voices. And it's personal memoir as well, because I wanted to work out when I was writing this how I came to write about beer, how I came to be fascinated about pubs, with pubs and beer from the age of, well, I tasted my first beer when I was 11, not in a pub, I hasten to add. As I write in the book, my grandfather, I come from North Wales, Llandudno, North Wales, and I grew up there. And my grandfather had deserted my grandmother in the 30s because he was accused of embezzlement in Llandudno Town Hall in the accounts, and it wasn't him. But as the story went in the family, he was a weak man and he fled. And I say I write about this, but he also was a pub man. So I think that's where I get it from. But I didn't really know him until the last few years of his life when he came back to Llandudno after having a stroke. And my great aunt, who brought my father up, put him in a shed at the bottom of the garden to live. And this was a man who'd had a stroke in his 70s because she took in lodgers. And they were mainly from the hills, well, what we call the hills in places like Llanrwst. Anyone's heard of Llanrwst? Betws-y-Coed, or Betys-y-Coed, as people might say it. And me and my brother used to call them hillbillies, which not very. Well, we spoke Welsh, but they were. Oh, Auntie Blanche does a lovely dinner, and we're thinking, no, she's the worst cook in the family. So there's stories like that. I meld into it, but I wanted to work out. My father. There's this story. There's this thing about where when you're growing up, especially young men, you go to the pub, your dad's there, or your uncle's there, so you behave. I don't know if it still happens, but I didn't have any of that. I just went to the pub with my mates and misbehaved. And my mother was a bit annoyed with me. Next morning, you smelled like a brewery was an often heard thing. But I wanted to try and understand that as well. So there's all these things that go into it, but primarily it's about pubs and how I travelled around. I know the publisher said I was in search of the best pub, but it's a bit like being asked, what's your favourite beer? I get asked that quite a lot, and half the time it's like, one writer sadly passed about 18 years ago. He was our doyen, Michael Jackson, not the singer obviously. He was the beer hunter, and he used to say when he got asked what was his favourite beer, it was the one I have in my hand. Mind you, if that's Old Speckled Hen, it isn't my favourite beer, or something like that, because I don't, there's a lot of beers I don't like, there's a lot of beers I love, but I'm a beer judge as well, by the way, so I've learned on how to distinguish between different varieties of beers. And one of my favourite categories to judge is what we call international lager, things like Budweiser, Heineken. They're not my choice of drink, but I like the fact that I can identify everything in it that makes it a beer for people who like it. You've got sweet corn and broccoli on the nose, which sounds really appetising. And if you leave it too long, it smells of burnt rubber. That's Carling, that is. I did try an experiment once in a pub. So I started writing the book. Obviously, started travelling. I went up to Scotland, the east of England, Wales, and I live in the west. So we live in the West Country. So I used the West Country as well. Then I went to the South Coast. And one of the things I did, I worked out the other day, I've got at least 5 pubs I go to regularly in Exeter. Not every night, I hasten to add. But 2 of them are real, what I'd say, locals. One's called the Topsham Brewery, and I don't know if anyone knows Exeter. Topsham is 5 miles outside Exeter, but this is in the middle of Exeter on the quay. And I often say it's a brew pub, and I often say to one of the brewers, how come you named it Topsham? I said, I don't know. We had kit from an old Topsham brewery, and then we just ended up calling it the Topsham Brewery. So that is one mine. It's in an old 19th century warehouse, and the other one is the Bridge Inn in Topsham. It's really in Topsham, and it is where famously the Queen went to in 1998, I think it was, her first pub she ever went to. And God, doesn't Caroline the landlady let you know, even though I've known her for so long. But they were the 2 regular pubs I'd go to, almost like to gather my thoughts with my notebook. And so I called them like my Greek chorus. I go back to these, and I go back to them in the book. And one of the great things I found out at Topsham was Caroline, the landlady, the Bridge Inn at Topsham. Caroline once showed me a visitor's book from the 1920s, and she said, "Look at that name." I said, "Oh right, Rippentrop." I thought, really? And she said, yeah, I think he was a wine salesman or champagne salesman, and he'd called in. And I write in the book, that was before he came a Von and led to all sorts of trouble, including Nuremberg. And then she also showed me, it's been, this pub, the Bridge in Topsham, has been in the same family since the late 19th century, like her father, her grandfather. Like I was in the parlour recently, a couple of months back, to sit outside in this weather, and there was a picture of a First World War soldier on the wall with his sweetheart, presumed, And I said, who's that then? She said, oh, it's my grandfather. I said, oh, well, he obviously came back safe. But she told me these stories about in the 30s and in the 50s and 60s, the pub was the centre of a community. And Topsham is quite shishy now. It's a bit like Southwold, a bit grittier than, I don't know if people know Southwold on the Suffolk coast. It's you know, she said to me that houses that I was told not to walk down that street when I was young now go for $500,000. But her grandfather used to do all sorts of clubs for people, you know, sort of, and one of them she showed me the notes from. It was called the Clock Club, and it's in the book. And I wrote about how it was just these people, and they used to meet every week and have tripe suppers, which not my game at all, which Caroline's grandmother used to cook for them. And you look at the minutes, and there's about 5 members of the committee, and they're all like giving themselves names after musical terms, like control, bass, anyway. But someone's just put bass and Guinness, bass, obviously, and Guinness, because they were really, you know, they had a real sense of humour. But there's some real poignant stuff in their minutes where they talk about, they all got numbers, and it's like number 39 died of the RAF 1940, September, and as I'm using the book, was he one of the few? And then there's Tiddles the dog, or something, that's a cat's name, really, but someone calling a dog Tiddles, I don't know. And Tiddles the dog made himself very friendly with everybody because he wanted some tripe. So all these things that I found on my journey. I went to several pubs in Aberdeen, and one was the Grill. I don't know if anyone knows of the Grill. It has been unchanged in its decor inside since the 1920s. In fact, from what I understand, it only put a women's lavatory in the 1970s, which is, right, okay. But I'm just sitting there, and these guys, and it was some, what's it called? A Burns night, because I thought, I want to get the atmosphere. I'm sure these pubs are going to be bursting with people celebrating Robbie Burns. No, it was quite quiet. And then some guys came in, and I think they were oil workers or something, you know, come off the rigs. And they were quite big guys, very well behaved. But there were a couple of shabby looking fellas behind them. And one had a plastic bag, which, you know, it's sad, you see them, they've got their whole world's belongings in them. And one of them was slapping his head, wandering around, then slapping his mate's face, and I thought, oh, here we go. And he sat next to me, and he goes, and I'm going to swear now, because I've just been accused on Amazon of being quite coarse in my language, but he just looked at my Kindle, because I had my notebook and my Kindle there, and he goes, what the fuck is that? And then he sort of started telling me about his dead daughter and everything, and then he got thrown out, but he'd walked off with my neck warmer, which I thought, well, he probably needs it more than I do. But these were the events throughout that year of me travelling that I came across. You know, I went to a pub in the Black Country, Batham's Brewery, anyone? And it's the Vine, or the Bull and Bladder, right next to the brewery. They're a very old school family brewery in the Black Country, and they only do a mild and a bitter. And in fact, they have more styles of pork scratchings behind the bar than they do beer styles. And I got talking to, what were they called? John, and I can't remember his name, his wife of his name, it's in the book. The name of his wife, not the name of the wife of his name. And he was sitting in a chair, and she said, by the bar, she said, that's the dead man's chair. Everyone who sits in there dies. Well, I've been doing all right for the last few weeks. And then I started talking to them, and then their son joined them, and he goes, this was the first pub I got pissed in with some builders I used to, and they still drink here. And then, you know, then his wife joined us, and she was telling me about, because I wondered why she had riding boots on, and she had a horse and cart outside. It was great. And those are the moments, the occasions, the encounters I searched for. And I was making some notes about, you know, I've been doing quite a lot of talks, and I was making some further notes and just thinking about how I didn't know I was going to meet these people. And when you do these things, when you do these travels, you could just sit in a soulless pub and you think, well, this isn't going anywhere. But a lot of this book relied on chance. For instance, not just people, but things I saw. I went to a wonderful pub called the White Horse in Suffolk, in Edwardstone, which is a little hamlet just not far from Ipswich, which is a city, or is it a city? Yes, which I'm never going back to. I didn't enjoy it at all. Hope there's no one here from Ipswich. But I walked 2 miles from this small village outside Ipswich. A friend of mine from further up the coast gave me a lift. And as I walked, I was being a bit of a pretend Edward Thomas, you know, the poet. I'm a great fan of his work. In fact, I drove past Addlestrop the other day. I was in Oxfordshire going to see a brewery. And so I just thought, well, I'm trying to see what plants these are. And I'm thinking, I don't know. That looks like a crocus. I don't think so. And so I'm walking along, and I came to a war memorial in a fork in the roads. As I'm using the book was the men whose names are on that memorial just outside Edwardstone. They had come to a fork in the road and they took the wrong fork because their names appeared on that memorial, and I'm amused about that. When I got to the pub, and it's run by a young couple, Tom and Danny, a really lovely couple. They did have a brewery until recently called Little Earth Brewery, and I saw all these old photographs on the wall of, you know, past regulars. And I looked at some of the names, and I jotted down the names, or I'd taken a photograph of the names on the War Memorial, and you could see there were names after the First World War of people, you know, relatives in the football teams, in the various dart teams. And that's another theme I look at in pubs, is how they keep people alive. We might be forgotten, you know, when we pass, but you go into a pub, like there's a pub in Dartmoor, on the edge of Dartmoor, Iddesleigh, where the Duke of York, where famously Michael Morpurgo heard the stories that basically led him to write War Horse. And there's pictures of locals, regulars, from the 50s, black and white ones, and there's one section, there's 6 of them, and there must have been a darts night or something, and you see these people. Presumably someone might know their names, some regulars, but I would have thought they're probably gone by now. But their names, their faces are remembered. And that's how pubs keep us alive sometimes. There are melancholy moments in the book. You know, there are, which I will read from one. In fact, I'm going to do a reading now, not a melancholy one. It's going to be, I've realised how when you read from a book at a reading, don't go on too long. So hopefully, I've been honing it down, and hopefully, you know, this is the opening of, this is the introduction. And I hope it sets the scene for what I was, you know, the book itself. I'm in Suffolk, in Southwold, in February, and T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and Chaucer get a name check. Anyway, I will read it. Oh, my glasses have missed it up. Never mind. Geoffrey Chaucer and T.S. Eliot might well have agreed across the divide of centuries that April was the cruelest month. But as I anchored myself above the hard, wintry beach of Southwold, looking out over the turbulent surface of the North Sea, I felt that February was making its own pitch for being the most venomous time of the year. The wind was biting and bestial, blowing as energetically as a breakdancer swirling about on the streets of New York in the early 1980s. This was the kind of persistent gale that didn't just ruffle your hair, but made an attempt to tear it out by its roots. As I made my death-defying stand on the concrete strand of the promenade, feeling like Custer at Little Bighorn, I grimaced out towards the sea, the tops of incoming waves frothing away as if an eternal cappuccino maker was hard at work. Neptune's very own barista, perhaps. As each wave crashed in and dragged its captive swag of pebbles backwards, creating their own Valkyrie chorus of ceaseless shrieks, Matthew Arnold's elegantly elegiac poem, Dover Beach, sprung to mind, where the ebb and flow of noise on the eponymous beach had inspired the writer to meditate on the loss of faith as history moved forward during a time of progress and scientific discoveries. On this wild hunt of a February afternoon, history was certainly in my crosshairs. Looking southwards, following the line of the coast, I could see the flattened sand dunes and cracked cliffs of the vanished city of Dunwich. Further on stood the concrete hulk of the nuclear power plant Sizewell B. By the way, when I did this reading in Southwold in October, someone said it's Sizewell A. Okay. A block-shaped full stop to the story that the view told me. Another screeching drag of pebbles came from the beach, and I decided it was time to go to the pub. Sanctuary awaited me at the Lord Nelson, which was not too many well-measured paces away along East Street. Turning my back on the turmoil of the sea, there it was, the pub sign swaying in the zealous zephyrs, as if auditioning for a casting role as Treasure Island's Admiral Benbow Inn. Built in the 18th century and a short stroll from the town centre where its owner Adnams Brewery stands, the Nelly was apparently once called the Raven, though I've also heard that its former name was actually Noah's Ark. Whatever the truth, I presume its name was changed when a horseman delivered news of Nelson's victory and death at Trafalgar. Incidentally, despite coming from neighbouring Norfolk, Nelson never drank there, but then perhaps George Orwell did when he stayed with a friend in Southwold in 1931. He certainly thought he saw a ghost in the churchyard at the neighbouring village of Walberswick. Dwelling further on Treasure Island, I recalled that if you looked up towards the roof, you would see a dormer with a small window on its side, from which there was a view of the sea. Tradition had it that this was used by smugglers. I looked up, and there it was, though whether smugglers used it, I wouldn't know. And anyway, as James Joyce had Stephen D. Adler say in Ulysses, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. Inside the pub, tradition took a well-practiced bow with its flagstone floors and high wooden settles, as well as pewter mugs hanging above the central bar. Here, as if I was witness to a kind of sympathetic magic practiced by one of the gods of brewing, ceramic hand pumps of Adnams beers lined up at the bar like a formation of Roman soldiers, standing rigid on an imaginary wall at the end of the known whirl. Elsewhere, there was a jumble of beer and brewery artefacts, as well as photographs of regulars, this is what I was on about, lining the wooden gantry that framed the bar. I was relieved to see that my two favourite brewing memorabilia, I had been there several times before, battered and ancient tin signs for Adnams beers, including its potent barley wine Tally-Ho, could still be seen on the wall in the corridor leading to the loo. This Tally-Ho was a mahogany brown slow sipper of a beer, which would have been the ideal accompaniment to this inclement day, but sadly it was not available, as it is only made once a year before Christmas and casks were soon polished off, although it is not unknown for some licensees to store one in the cellar for a year and treat their lucky regulars around about Christmas. Instead, I asked for a pint of Southwold Bitter, a well-worn favourite of mine, dark amber in colour and with a bark-like counterpoint of sweet malt and an earthy, citrusy hop character on the palate before a dry and bittersweet crescendo of a finish. This was the perfect beer to drink while waiting for the furies outside to drop. As I studied my beer, the gentle murmur of fellow escapees drifted through the bar, a benevolent breeze of conversation totally at odds with the turmoil outside. A man asked for a half of bitter mixed with a half of old ale, while a couple of other men discussed Southwold Town's FC's upcoming fixture against Halesworth FC and hoped that the wind would have dropped by then. A cute sausage dog who belonged to a member of the pub staff, tail wagging like an out-of-control metronome, was led out for its afternoon walk, and the open door gave a brief glimpse and sound of the elemental wrath outside. My glass was soon empty, and I decided to order another pint and settle in for the afternoon. I first visited the Lord Nelson, or the Nelly as it's called, at the start of the 1990s during a bleak January weekend, which is another month that probably wants to raise its hand in the air to try and claim an immortal sense of barbarity. It was a cold day outside, as drab as a suburban dream, but when I and a couple of friends entered, it felt as if we'd arrived at a place of refuge, a retreat from the brutalist nature of the weather. It was warm and well lit, with a log fire glowing kindly in a grate, like the beam of a smile from a favourite aunt. And over 30 years on, I still recall experiencing a sense of domestic homeliness that I certainly didn't feel then in my cramped one-bedroom flat in North London. We were home. It was busy, but casual in its well-ordered chaos, and moving towards the bar, it didn't feel as if we were invading other people's personal spaces. The three of us ended up talking to an army sergeant and his wife. However, I didn't join in when one of my mates ended up drinking flaming drambuies. Anyone ever done that? With the military man. I knew it was bleak and cold outside, but I did have limits what I would do to keep warm. Besides, the shriek of my mate, followed by a yell of, "I've burnt my moustache," was a definite discouragement to join in. This was an ideal pub for winter, I remember thinking at the time. Somewhere you could retreat to join in conversation with like-minded souls, or just sit in a corner with a book and slowly allow yourself to contemplate life in the company of several pints. Since then, I've been at the Lord Nelson during every season throughout the year, but I enjoy this pub best during the austere months of winter, especially with the closeness of the torrid, mood-changing nature of the North Sea. However, like all the best pubs, the Lord Nelson changes organically and unconsciously throughout the year, responding to the wheel of time and the changing of the seasons. It lives with the rhythms of the year, acknowledging their various moods and becoming one with them. In the summer, the bar is bright and airy, almost Scandi-like in its embrace of the season's ethereal and luminous nature. The garden at the back might be Lilliputian, but there is a sense of light and grace when you take your peerless pint of ghost ship out there. Autumn, on the other hand, sees the start of the retreat, along with hopeful visits to the back garden and conversations about an incoming storm. After the hardships of winter, with several glasses of tally-ho, spring is about rejuvenation, and a glass of Mosaic Pale Ale is raised to the coming of lighter days. Even though, for me, the Lord Nelson is best when experienced as a winter pub, it is a pub for all seasons, an idea that has always bewitched me as the year turns and swirls around me like an elemental merry-go-round. One of the things reason going back to why I wanted to write this book, I've always had this fascination, this joy, this appreciation of the seasons. And as I write in the book at one stage, a friend of mine who sadly died 3 years ago, he went in the late 80s, he got a job in Barcelona teaching. And I was living in London then, with my then girlfriend, and he came to see us. And he's going on about Barcelona, and I've been there a few times now, and I really love it. He said it's great, it's fantastic, this, that, and the other. But he said the one thing I miss is the seasons. He said he only felt there were 2 seasons in Barcelona. And one of the things I wrote about in this was, I am concerned, and this is a bigger subject than I can write about. Our seasons are merging into each other. Today, I don't know if it's official or not, it's the first day of summer. But it's felt like summer in Exeter anyway. It's felt like summer for the last few weeks. One of the things I feel is that the pub almost it's like a Christmas card. We see these old Christmas cards with snow on them. Of course, I don't know, you might get it up here, but we rarely get snow at Christmas. And the pub, during the seasons, almost represents what the seasons were in some ways. So you can go to the pub in October. It might be really hot outside, but hopefully the landlord's got a fire on, and you'd be really baking. But, you can feel there's a serenity about it, in my view. One of the things, when I wrote this book, and when I'd written the original feature, which was, you can probably find online, it was for Beer Magazine, the Campaign for Real Ale's 3 monthly magazines. They do quite a bit for them now and again, because they pay quickly, which is great in my line of work. And one of the things was that landlords can say, oh, new summer menu, new spring menu. That's not what the book's about. Or I'll put up some Christmas decorations. No, there's a mood. As I said earlier, it's the ambience of the pub. And I presume majority of you go to the pub quite regularly, or a pub. I go far too much because, if I'm not going anywhere, if I'm not travelling, I'll pop down to either the Topsham tap or cycle over to the bridge in Topsham and just chat with people, talk with brewers or just talk with people I don't know and I'd probably never see again, but it's great. That's what the pub's for me. And another theme that runs through the book, but it's very light, is that, I don't know about you guys, but I missed the pub during the lockdowns. I really did. You might be surprised at this. The 2 places I missed the most during the lockdowns was the pub and the gym. Because given my profession, I do try and keep myself fit. You can sit in we had really nice weather in the first lockdown, I seem to remember, and all the breweries at the time were trying to get rid of all their stock. And I remember getting so much beer sent to me, but it wasn't the same. I had my wife, my wife and I are separated, I write about it, but it's not, we're very good friends. So she lives around the corner from me, so our son was there then, and so we would just all lived in the same house until both my son and wife said, you're just talking all the time, why don't you go back to yours? All right. But I missed all that. You can sit in your garden with beer and a book, and I remember maybe 2 months into that first lockdown, I bumped into someone I know from the Topsham tap, actually one of the co-founders who was then the brewer. And we spoke for half an hour in the street. obviously keeping social distance and everything, we were just on our bicycles and, bumped into each other. And it was like, and I don't know about you, I got sick of doing Zoom as well. In fact, I've got a real thing about not doing Zoom anymore if I can help it. But that is another theme throughout it. And it is an important place, the pub. It's not just about going down there and getting a few pints down you. It's the origins of the name, a public house. It can be a home and it can be too much of a home sometimes. And, but it is where we go to meet people. It is where, as I wrote once, especially about country pubs, where people get to know each other, where they meet each other, where in some pubs, I'm looking for a guy who could do some woodwork for me. Yep, great. Talk to matey over there. We meet people. You don't get that in a post office. You don't hang around. It'd be a bit peculiar if you hung around. Mind you, are there any post office left now? But if you hung around in a village shop or something. And there's a side thing here, talking about post office, in the Topsham Tap. And I don't know what everyone feels about it, but one of my bugbears in the last couple of years has been queuing in pubs. I don't know if anyone notices it or it still happens. If I'm sitting in the Topsham Tap, sometimes I'm like, oh, please. And there's a poster there. This is not a post office. Please don't queue. And the problem is, they've got a little pizza van, and staff are trying to get through. And yeah, I try not to be Mr. Grumpy about that, but I think I'm not going to go far too much in it. As I said to you earlier on, it was all about meeting people. And I've told you about some of the people I met, but it didn't always work. I went to a pub in Shropshire in a town or village called Bishop's Castle. It's the 3 Tons, and there's a brewery of the same name in a yard behind. It's a different business, and I got a bus from Shrewsbury. I got a train to Shrewsbury, then a bus from Shrewsbury there. And it allowed me to muse on the countryside and everything. And it's border country as well. Given that I'm Welsh, I wouldn't go back. I don't want to go back to live in Wales. Nothing personal, but I love border countries. I love that sort of. You don't know which part of the world you're in. Are you in the Welsh part? Are you in the English part? And they have echoes of the past in them because some of the names of the towns. Like there was one name I remember noting the bus went through, and it was, I think, Bury, which is an English word. And I can't remember the Welsh word, but I mention it in the book. But, you just, that feeling you're on the edge of 2 different cultures. But, the 3 Tons, which I had been to quite a few times over the years, and as I said, they're not linked with the brewery, but they had the brewery's beers on. And the pale ale was superb, and I fell on it like a wolf on the fold. And I sat there, though, and it was quiet. It was a Friday afternoon, and, as I said to you earlier, I've got my notebook, and I'm reliant on people. And I did write about the pub in it, but it just felt that I wanted to make the point that I didn't always get it right. I came away from it thinking it's not as there's something there that is missing at the moment from what it used to be. And I've since found out that they used to serve all the brewery's beers. But there's a certain multinational company that owns the beer supply, Heineken. And they were like saying, no, you can't have that brewery, which is literally 100 metres away. No, we've got to, use lorries to get things over. And eventually, the locals stopped going there. So they eventually put one of their beers on, which again, people power perhaps. And then there were, some people really got on my nerves, but they made for good copy. There was one guy in the Pride of Peveril in Manchester. Anyone heard of that place? It's one of these old places. There's 2. There's the Pride of Peveril and Britain's Protection, which is just around the corner. And they're real survivors. And I went in there. I went to both of them at lunchtime in Manchester. And one of them, there was this guy there. And I think there was a lot of solicitors' offices and everything. And he came in and he saw his mates. And it was like, I don't know if anyone remembers Rupert Pipkin in Robert De Niro in King of Comedy, that's it. And he was just like that, just telling jokes to these 2 people. And it was like, I know you're making me good copy, mate, but you're driving me around, it's getting on my nerves a bit. Obviously, I didn't say anything. It's not my job to. But again, it's that chance thing. It just... And another great group of people I met, the Albion in Conway, in my part of the world, in North Wales, they call themselves the Committee. And they were locals, and anyone who came in and they wanted to talk, they talked to them, they welcomed them, excuse me, because there's a lot of tourists come in, you know, because of the big castle and everything. And I was sitting there talking with them, and these two fellas of a certain age, excuse me a minute, might have to have some water, of a certain age came in, and they all started clapping them. I said, why? Why are you clapping them? Well, they've lived to survive another day. And, right, okay. Excuse me a minute, I just have a... So yeah, there was that, and there's another one that I'm trying to remember. I had to go to Liverpool. I wanted to go to Liverpool because my grandmother, again, I write about her in it as well, Liverpool Irish. There's a clue in my name, Tierney, Irish, Jones, obviously Welsh. And I went on Twitter, when I was on Twitter, and, you know, Liverpool, give me some good pubs. And someone said, go to the Globe. It's Liverpool in a pint. And I thought, oh, God, I hope it's not going to be cliched. You know, Ken Dodd. I don't know if you're served by Ken Dodd or Jimmy Tarbuck or Lulu. No, she's not from Liverpool, is she? In Glasgow. But it was, I went in about, just after midday. And it was Liverpool. Wisecracks, but nothing, you know, they were just like the easy flow of language that beer and the pub produces in people. And I feel there's an articulacy about pub goers sometimes. Yeah, of course we hear a load of nonsense as well. But you hear surreal stuff which sometimes I don't know where it comes from. And, you know, people were talking about, it was St. Valentine's Day because this was in a sub-chapter called Romance. So I thought, what's it going to be like in pubs on St. Valentine's Day on my own? Because you know what they're like, some of these pubs. It's like, we've got a special night on this, that, and the other. But I went to pubs which weren't doing special stuff because I wanted to eavesdrop on people. You know, there was one fella saying, oh, God, I'm really in trouble with my wife because I'm going to see Liverpool play tonight. I forgot it was St. Valentine's Day. And someone else was saying about the cost of, I don't know if you know the Belgian beer, Leffe. L-E-F-F-E, which is not, I mean, I go to Belgium a lot and I'm not a great fan of it. But anyway, and he was going, I'm not going to even try the Liverpool accent. Last time I asked for a pint of Leffe, it was £8. I said, I'm going to the supermarket next time to have a drink. And I'm thinking, well, you're going to miss out on the experience of the pub. Why not have a half? I didn't say that, obviously. That would be a bit rude. And then I walked, and then there was some great I'm going to try and say this. You can see why it wasn't me that did the Audible version. It was part of my contract, and I was like, oh, God. Because I'm quite good at, you know, I used to be in a band singing a long time ago, but that's easy. And, you know, talking like this is easy because you can digress. But when you're having to sit in a studio and read, thank God I didn't have to do that. But so I walked, and so there were these great moments of chance where I walked past the bit where the cavern was, and there was a statue of Brian Epstein there. And there was a guy singing, because I was on my way to the Lion Tavern, which I really recommend as well. And he was singing something. And, you know, you just have these moments where when you, as a writer, you just come across these moments where everything, you know, I was able to write about it. And at the time, I was feeling a bit emotional about something that wasn't going to happen. So, you know, I write about how, I can't remember, but there were just these serendipity. There was a serendipity about these moments, and that's what I try to put across in this book. This is from Winter, and its subheading is Celebration, and the headline for this little bit is Morning Suite. There was another way in which the pub in Winter was about celebration, and this was not so cheerful, or everyone shaking hands and clapping shoulders and smiling like a glow stick. The pub at this time of the year could also act as a backdrop for remembering and celebrating someone, a quiet hollowing out of memory, a place where silence and the gentle inebriation of beer could bring you to terms with loss, which is something I experienced during the writing of this book. As a journalist whose skill set also involves editing, I found myself reluctant to include the next few paragraphs without changing them. But they were written in a pub on the day I had been told my mother had died. So, apart from a few edits for clarity, I will leave it as I wrote it, a raw first edition of a pub's ability to help me celebrate Mum. But as I reread these words, I realised that they were almost a catharsis, therapeutic in their vision,
even though a darker shade of memory intervened as I wrote further and deeper. So here they are, both in a sense celebratory and as a memorial. These words were written a few hours after I'd heard that my mother had died. It was not a surprise, as my brother had told me the night before that she was unresponsive. She died on the day of Imbolc, the start of spring according to pagans, a day I would celebrate with a few quiet thoughts. But it remains winter, and I am wintry. It had been expected, but despite all my protestations that I would work once I'd heard the news, I couldn't. So I took myself off on my bicycle and took refuge in a pub in the Poachers in Ede, just outside Exeter. I wanted some countryside without having to cycle too far. Inside the main bar with the sofas and armchairs, I sat, one of which contained the slumbering form of the pub's boxer, that's a dog by the way, whose Churchillian face reminded me of Monty. As a footnote here, I have mentioned Monty before. He was a boxer that Jane and I were given as a wedding present in 1994. He died far too young in 2002. The comforting crackle of logs burning in the fireplace, a local on his phone. I'm in the pub drinking wine. How long are you going to be? Do you want me to get you anything, or are you just going to pick me up? There are two pugs, both of whom get on my lap and start trying to lick my face. The boxer continues to sleep. The older pug that is, sits on my lap, while the younger one sits on the sofa next to a young woman who is presumably part of the pub. There's a palpable sense of joy and cheerfulness in the mood of the pub, which pleases me, which shows how much a pub can soothe the soul in the wake of a major bereavement. The boxer gets out of the chair and patrols the bar, while the older of the pugs sits on the armchair at the back, his rear to the fire, as if to put himself in charge in dominion. There is a murmur of conversation at the bar counter. A man looks at his phone, the rustle of a crisp bag, total silence it seems apart from the fire, and the occasional words spoken at the bar. I recall how Mum once said to me that she couldn't go into pubs on her own as she was a woman. I wonder then if she was ever lonely. Her time in the last 3 years has passed in the slow swamp of immobility, and now it is done. The dog's name's Adelphi, the older pug, Pumpkin, the younger one, and Boots. I recall the time when I took her and my nana to a pub outside Llangollen, which I had read about in a camera guide at the time. It was very basic, and both of them were distinctly unimpressed. That was one of the memories of her and me in pubs. We went to quite a few, usually to eat. When we met her landlord, who was reputedly a massive womanizer, she said after he'd gone, "Hoggin drwg," which means bad boy in Welsh. "Thank you for your hospitality," said the wine drinker to no one in particular as he went outside to meet his wife. I would describe the Poacher's atmosphere as serene, calm, tranquil, cosy, warm, relaxing, reposing, creative, a place for remembrance. My mother died during the winter, but on the day of Imbolc, when light was being celebrated. She had mixed feelings towards me in pubs. She was concerned I spent too long in them, but did like a genuine one. And she was even relaxed in Woods, which was a bar I used to go to, at Christmas lunchtime. She also enjoyed the Boxing Day hunt meets at Woods. She was concerned about my drinking, but was proud of my books and newspaper articles and beer and pubs. The dogs in the pub are drowsy with the heat and relative warmth of the day. Outside the road is quiet. The kids are long home doing homework or watching TV or on their computer games, and all of a sudden I get a memory of baked beans and chips, which was one of my favourite meals as a kid. Mum would bring in plaice from the boats on Conway Quay on her way home, and sometimes liver, which I would kick up a fuss about. The lights on the wall are pale yellow, orange flames in the fireplace, red earth-coloured ceiling, Devon red. This afternoon in here has been a haven, a toll booth of memory, a homestead, a sinkhole of memory. More regulars come in and sit at the bar. Murmur of conversation. Almost feels like a still life. 5 people at the bar, 3 sitting down. One man, landlord, is looking at his phone. Another next to fire on a laptop. Half-full glass of Guinness. I find it amazing that this pub stays open all day, as when I came in there was one guy at the bar, the one who went away on his phone. In Spoons, a fresh-faced, trim-beard young guy asked me how my day was, and I laugh and say that my mother died today. He was the second person who asked me that question that day. The first one was a Hungarian woman who normally cuts my hair. I didn't tell her. He says that he visited the grave of his girlfriend today, and I was horrified. She was 19 and sliced open her veins on Christmas Day. His father killed himself when he was 9, and he found the body. Such is the toxicity of modern life that I found myself disbelieving him. But then I asked myself, why would you make up such stuff? The time spent in the village pub was a time of healing, but I couldn't see how a pub any pub could heal the broken memories and bruised heart of that young guy in an Exeter Wetherspoons. All I could hope for him would be, as Larkin once wrote, what will survive of us is love. Thank you. Shall I come over here now? Yeah.
So we do have some time for questions. We have about 10 minutes. At the front, let's start with that.
I live in Tadcaster, and the local brewing family there, run by Humphrey Smith.
Yeah, I know.
Bans music, bans digital devices. What's your opinion on pubs with music and digital devices?
Yeah, I remember all of that happening. I went to a London, because Sam Smith's have got quite a few pubs in London. I was in a London pub, and I was having a meeting with the organiser of a beer competition I was the chair of at the time, and she got a phone out, and I went, "You're not supposed to." And I thought, yeah, I mean, the bridge I mentioned earlier on in Topsham, they have a sign saying, "Please don't use your phone in here. It's a talking pub." But they're such a part of life now. The Sam Smith's one I think is extreme. I don't know why pubs sometimes have canned music on. And there's a bit in the book where I'm in a pub in Salisbury, and the Haunch of Venison, I don't know if anyone knows it, it's one of the oldest pubs there. And I was sitting there again, listening, talking, and this guy came up to the bar and he said, "Oh, this is a great pub," said to the barman. And he said, and he obviously knew. And he said, and then he stopped and he went, "But whoever chooses the music should be shot." And it was sort of 60s music. And I think the ban, from what I understand I've read, is going to be rescinded or it's going to be softened, because I think Humphrey Smith is retired. There was a big piece in The Guardian a few months back, which was very good about him. I've never been to the brewery. I don't know. I know one beer writer who's been to the brewery, and he's Bavarian, Marcus. And it's like, we tried to get in a few years back, several of us. We wrote to them and everything. And initially they said, yeah, as long as you don't bring Roger Protz. I don't know if you've heard of Roger Protz. He is like a preeminent beer writer in the field, because he's an old trot as well, and he's a campaigner, Mr. Camera, but he's a good friend of mine. And we said, well, Roger wasn't coming anyway, but we didn't go in the end. So I do think it's rather extreme in this day and age. And the other thing about Sam Smith is I find, people, the swearing thing. Yeah, I don't want to hear swear. I swear occasionally, too much sometimes. But yeah, if you've got kids in the pub as well, the last thing you want to hear is someone effing and blinding. But to sack a couple that have been running the pub when he's heard someone swearing, it's not their fault. That is grotesque, in my view. So I hope that sort of answers.
Thank you.
Right.
You described pubs that I've been going to for years as somewhat stereotypical of pubs in the past. Where do you think the pub is going in the future?
Cool. Future's always... I've got a book at home. I've got a big collection of books on pubs and beer. And in the late 60s, the breweries that owned the pubs, people like Watney's, I don't know if anyone's heard of Watney's, they were like folk devils that camera members used to frighten their kids with when they were trying to get them to sleep in the 70s. There were things like, they would be set up like space age, and you were supposed to have your beer through, what did I read once? They were set up like space rockets, or they had themes to them. We had the theme pub. So where are they going in the future? I think there's always a space for traditional pubs. But tap rooms are quite important now. That's how the smaller craft breweries, so-called, I don't use the word anymore, it's so overused. But the breweries like that is where it's going in one way. It is hard for pubs at the moment. Food is obviously a big driver. I like to think that there will be, people say the pub is dying. There's a comment on the book on Amazon. Like the book, but he said it makes me sad to think pubs are dying. Yeah, they are. You work on pubs. They are struggling. But I do feel that there will be pubs. Maybe there won't be so many. There aren't so many. But the ones that are still here, maybe we have better pubs. Because, you know, the sense of a good publican to me is being, or licensee, is hospitality. It's like, I was told by a landlord once that he said he trained all his staff as soon as they walked in, you know, to say, not to stand there looking at their phones or anything, you know, to say, hello, how can I help you? And I went to a pub on the Norfolk coast last week with a friend of mine, a beer writer called Pete Brown and his wife Liz. And we walked in and, you know, we didn't go, oh, we know everything about beer. We just went to the bar and this young lad just said, what would you like to drink? What do you like to drink? We've got a golden ale, we've got this, we've got that. And Pete afterwards was saying, that's brilliant. Because we know far too much about beer, Pete and I do, which is more than decent. But a lot of people don't, you know. I mean, so I think a good hospitality, a good welcome, but it's not always a balance to get right. And, you know, there's the pub companies, which is, it's a very hard subject, that one, to write about, you know, where landlords have to pay ridiculous rents and they just can't, you know, they can't survive. So where's the pub going in the future? I don't know, but I hope it's going in a good place.
It sort of ties in with that question, but driving around up here, you go through villages and so many pubs are closed down or they're for sale. I mean, do you think the village pub has a life still? Do you think it can carry on?
Yes, I do. Like, for instance, that was a village pub I was talking about, Ede, and it's a little village outside Exeter. And that's why I was amazed that it stays open all day, which is useful for me, because I think, I quite fancy having a pint at 3 o'clock in the afternoon or something. I'll cycle out there. There's 3 pubs in the village there. But on the other hand, I lived in a town until 2016. I lived on Exmoor for nearly 19 years, we did. And we lived in, our last address was in a town called Dulverton. I don't know if anyone knows it, the entrance. When we moved there, there were 4 pubs. There are now 2, from what I understand. And one of them majors in food, and the other is owned by St Austell Brewery. And the former landlord who sold it to them is a friend of mine. He messaged me, we were talking recently, and he said, it's not working there. So I do worry that would go. And a village without pubs, or a town without pubs, a small town. If I look on Exmoor itself, the pubs I used to visit in the late 90s, there's real attritional, you know, have closed, loads have closed. I mean, there weren't many up there, but there were, you know, they've just, and you, as you say, you can go through, I mean, in a village now, it's like the old blacksmith, the old bakery, the old inn. And I think, I mean, that pub I mentioned in Norfolk was is right on the edge of the village of Horsey, Horsey, just over the dunes from the North Sea. That seems to thrive. But there's a lot of bird watching out there. So a pub in an area where it's a destination place, you know, that will survive. But yeah, you're right. And also people are drinking at home, and it is expensive. People say to me, it's expensive. I mean, you know, I drink in my local, because my son used to work in the Topsham Tap for a few months last year. He's worked in the industry quite often and on. I'd get a 15% discount. That's how I can afford to drink in it. And yet, though, some breweries, there was a brewery from Burnt Mill Brewery. Anyone? You probably know. Suffolk. Very good beers. £8 for a pint in Exeter. That's a bit much. You know, I like their beers, but they just said the manager said it's expensive. You know, so the village pub will survive, but again, I do worry about the attritional rate of it.
It seems as the generations go on, fewer people are drinking, more people are seeking out low or no alcohol like spaces, and are kind of seeking towards 0% beers, for example. How do you see that kind of affecting pubs and those spaces going forwards?
Well, I think if they're serving it, and the Topsham Tap and both the breweries, those 2 I mentioned, I go to, they do serve it. Do serve. They have the Topsham Tap has a dedicated tap line from Bristol's Wiper and True, serving a 0.5 beer. I think if you make that that's the word I'm thinking of, offer there, you can still get people in. My son, actually, he I think he had his first 2 pints of beer this year on Friday. He's worked in a brewery and operations side of thing in London. He's worked in bars and pubs. But mind you, he'd have a leaving do, which knocked the stuffing out of him when he left for London again in November. So he just decided, I'm not drinking. In fact, I'm the only person who drinks in our family, it feels like at the moment. My wife doesn't drink, and the dog doesn't drink, and my son rarely drinks. So, but I think if a pub can offer that, and also the other thing is, they're not cheap beers. Because, Wiper and True in Bristol, I don't know if people know them, to get a low alcohol beer, you have to use certain ways. I think Wiper and True and Adnams in Southwold, they spent over £1 million getting a de-alcoholizer. Other people will arrest fermentation, or they'll use certain grains in it, so you haven't got so much sugar that creates alcohol. And I mean, I don't drink it much. As I said to you, abstinence is not a big thing of mine. And I'm old enough now, I'm old enough and stupid enough to drink what I like. There's some very good ones out there. But I do feel sometimes you drink one and you just think, yeah, I know it's non-alcoholic. I mean, who drinks them out here? Hands up? Quite a few? Sorry?
Drive-in.
Yeah. Oh, the quality is really good compared to what it used to be. Who remembers Caliper? No, not Caliper. Caliber. I mean, I travel a lot. In Bavaria, it's seen as it's promoted as an isotonic drink. So I do think if a pub sells them and, make sure that people know, then I think it will help them because, and again, it goes back to that, what's the atmosphere in them? Because, from my experience with my son, he's a bit more open now, but when he was about 20, we'd go into a pub and try him on cask beer, and he'd be like, what the hell is this, Dad? He's a bit more open now. I mean, I've always been open. I drink all sorts of beer, apart from Heineken and Budweiser.
We did just have one question in the middle from this guy, and then that'll be our last question.
You mentioned the Norfolk coast. I'm from a town on the Norfolk coast, and there were 2 lovely pubs in this town that seemed to be thriving on their own and have since become chain pubs. So they've sort of put up big TV screens everywhere and things like that. My question, I suppose, is those pubs seem to be quite dead now when they used to be thriving.
The TV screen pubs?
Yes, yeah. What is it that sort of those chains buy those pubs for when they don't seem to be appealing to the public, and what is it about them that sort of generates the money, I suppose?
Yeah, it could be money. Maybe, people who go to pubs, I talked about community value of pubs. If the TV's up there, you only want to go and see a football match or a rugby match now and again, and maybe you've got your community at home with, you buy cheap slabs of, I'm going to do a massive what's the word? Not generation. Well, maybe they're the sort of people who get a lot of beer from the supermarket, cheap. And what the lockdown did for us, and it was happening already, we don't have to go to the cinema because we can download stuff. We don't have to go and sit in a football match or rugby match because we can watch it online. We don't have to sit in a pub because we can get the beer and get some friends over. And on the other hand, what do we miss? You miss, especially if you go to a football match, you miss that feeling, that community of watching your team. Hopefully, score. I'm Arsenal, so we have a problem with that sometimes. And it's the same with the pub. So I have a cynical side to me with these pub companies, the chain pubs, that they're quite happy to run down these pubs because then they can sell them. And someone, it's a controversial subject in the industry, and there are some big big campaigners against the pub chains. And they're always asking us beer rights to write about it, but it's a very tricky, intricate subject, and I don't do business stuff. But I do feel, someone once said to me, that they're estate agents. They've got a property that's worth something, and if they just, but it's harder to get to, you would know more about this, but what's it, community of value, asset of value?
Yeah, asset of community value,
yeah,
yes.
So it is a bit harder for them just to get rid of somewhere, but it does feel, a cynical side to me, run it down and great, we'll get more money for our shareholders. But, you know, again, and also maybe the TV thing, as I say, doesn't give it that sense of community. You go to the other two pubs, and what's the town, by the way?
Sheringham.
Oh, right, I know what you mean, yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, I run a good pub. I know it sounds a bit like that strapline for the Kevin Costner film about baseball. Run a pub and a good pub, and the people will come. Maybe not always, but you'd hope they would. So I hope that helps.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your fascinating talk. It's been absolutely great. And could we just end by giving Adrian a really big hand to say thank you?